So now the question is, does it matter what type of financing a company use in a perfect world? Right? And perfect means no tax, no transaction costs, but also perfect information. And perfect competition. Okay. So with all these in mind, I'm just going to use one example to show that why it actually doesn't matter. Now let's see, it's just with a very simple company, right? Okay, so now the Mulligan theorem. So the Ghilenni Miller theorem. Okay, it's actually a very old theorem. It's 1958, right? It's actually quite old. It says under the above conditions, it doesn't matter. The means of financing does not matter. Right. So the example I'm going to use to illustrate this is, let's just say we have a firm with 100 existing shares. Right? And let's say the price is $1 per share. Right? $1 per share, just to make it simple. And it's now interested in investing in a new project. It's actually risk-free, to make things simple. Because it's perfect information, we might as well just assume it's risk-free. And this project has an expected return of $110, right? So it pays back 110, and it requires $100 of upfront investment. And just to make things even simpler, risk-free rate is 0, so we don't need to concern about interest. Okay, now this is almost the simplest example we can go, right? It's risk-free, and the return is higher than the investment, so it's worthwhile to invest. And this question is set up in a way such that the company has enough money, right? It has 100 existing shares with $1 each, so we're assuming that we just assume that the money isn't tied up anywhere. You can use the money if it wants to. And obviously, that's what we're going to consider first, right? Cash financing. So if you use cash, we're going to think about what's the value of the firm going to be after the investment. So it's very simple. It's just the existing value minus the cash used for investment, right? And in return, it's going to get the revenue of the project. And the math is very simple. it has existing 100 shares times $1 each, minus it's going to use $100, plus it's going to get 110. In the end, it's going to worth 110. So it's set up in a way that it's very simple. So if you use cash, the math is very simple. Subtract the cost, adds in the benefit, that's what you expect you're going to get. What about borrowing money? Now, if you borrow money, right, then, so this is debt financing. Value of the firm equals to, once again, existing value minus the debt you have to pay back, plus revenue from project, right? And if you think about it, if you're borrowing $100 and you're getting 110 in back, it's really the same as cash. The reason is we assume interest to be zero. So the question is, what's the role of interest? Since obviously we assumed interest to be zero, which gives us this result, but then usually interest is not zero. If interest rate is not zero, would it change this result that it doesn't matter whether you use debt or cash? Yes or no? Well, in the perfect world, even with interest rate, we usually assume that the borrowing rate and the lending rate are the same, right? So it doesn't matter whether you use debt or cash in a perfect world with positive interest rate, because if you decide to borrow money, you would have $100 in the bank from the existing value, and that should generate interest. Now, once again, remember, this is a perfect world. This is a perfect world. So whatever you don't lend, you put in the bank, you get interest. And we kind of assuming that you get the same interest as the rate of lending, right? So what you have is if interest is not zero, the interest from cash not used would equal interest paid on debt, right? So this is a perfect world. This happens. In a competitive market, interest on debt equals interest from savings. So the interest from cash not used would equals to interest paid on debt. So it cancels out. Doesn't matter. And finally, we think about equity financing. Once again, this is just a simple example, so we pretty much just start with the insight we get from above. Okay. Equity financing is a bit more difficult because now you're involved issuing shares. So let's say you issue S shares to raise 100, right? So now we're saying, okay, we want to invest in this new company. We want to use cash. Maybe we don't have the cash, so we need to raise money through the stock market. and we're going to issue S shares to raise $100. Now the value of firm is the existing value, which has not been used, plus the revenue from the project, well, equals to 100 plus 110 equals to 210. What about the cost? The cost is paid by the money raised from new shares. So it's not deducted out of the original company. So the value is truly 210. Obviously, this is not free because you have more shares now. How many more shares? $100 S, right? You raise the money through shares, which means each shareholder now owns 1 over 100 plus S of the company. Each share represents 1 over 100 plus F of the company. Now here is the part where the competitive market assumption is needed. Under the assumption of competitive market, we're going to assume that there's going to be no profit. No profit. So what will you have in a case when there's no profit? When there's no profit, if the investors put in $100, they're going to get back $100. That's what it means. No profit. No. So new shareholders claim equals to money raised. This is why perfectly competitive market is needed. And their claim, right? Their claim, how much do they have? Now, the new shareholders purchased S shares, right? And out of a total base of 100 plus S shares, the company is now worth 210. So that's what they have. And in a perfectly competitive market with no profit, that should equals to 100. So if you solve it with a calculator or by rearranging, that's 90.9, right? Okay, all right. Now, we are thinking about whether it's different between raising money through cash or debt or equity, right? So to make the comparison meaningful, you must be thinking about the existing shareholders, not the new shareholders. Because if you think about it, when the existing shareholders make decisions, they're thinking about themselves. They don't really care about the new ones coming in. So to make things comparable, we're just going to think about what's the value owned by the existing shareholders. So all shareholders claim, right? Now we know they own 100, right? Out of 100 plus 90.9 times 210, which is 110. So the key insight is the amount the investors own doesn't change regardless of the method of financing, right? It's the same. Okay, so that's the Modigliani-Miller theorem in an example. Doesn't matter in a perfect world. It's all the same. Now, but we have just seen data telling us that it's not the same. So what the theorem, the reason why the theorem is meaningful is to tell us that there must be something violating the assumptions we made, right? In the real world, it's not perfect. We do not have a situation where there's no transaction cost, no tax, perfect information, and perfectly competitive market, right? And you can start with the easiest one. It's no tax. In the real world, we do have tax, and tax structure is one big reason why company decides to do one thing in one way and in the other way versus another way, right? So let's talk about how tax structure, roughly speaking, works, right? So now, how is tax structure? How does tax work? If you use cash, you're using your own money. You're not paying anyone anything, right? You're not paying anyone anything. So all the money you take in would come in terms of, so you have revenue, right? Your revenue, then you subtract your cost, then you have like your net income, right? Okay. So you need to pay corporate tax on the net income. Okay. Now let's think about the debt financing versus equity financing. In debt financing, how does it work? Debt financing, the principal is obviously a cost, right? The principal is a cost that you subtract from to get, so you don't pay tax on the principal. What about the interest? Interest is usually also considered a cost, and it's tax deductible, right? It's tax deductible. So you don't pay tax on interest from the company's perspective, right? You pay the interest, the interest is deductible from tax. For the receiver, either it's a bank or it's bondholders, you do pay tax because interest, it's a form of capital income. So you have to pay capital gain tax. Okay. Finally, equity financing. Equity financing, equity is not a cost in terms of tax purpose, right? So the whole 110 in our example, in the whole 110 revenue that comes in, right? You first subtract the cost of 100, but then in a competitive market, your investors would demand a positive return if the interest rate is positive, right? So the return you're supposed to pay the shareholders is not tax deductible, which means you first have to pay capital gains tax before you can pay dividends. And once you pay dividend, the dividend is also subject to capital gains tax. In essence, there is double taxation compared to debt, right? So if you believe the market is efficient, then you would prefer debt over equity, simply because of the tax structure, right? So that's one reason why. Tax structure is a big reason. If you read about financial news, companies do a lot of things for tax reasons. Shield companies, right? The Panama Papers, like you open companies in BVI because you don't, then you would not need to pay tax on the income you've put there, right? And then less well known is the practice called inversion, where a bigger company